This is Hidetaka Miyazaki, and to put it mildly, he is a pretty big deal. The man is responsible for some of the most beloved and influential games of all time, serving as the creative lead on Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Sekiro and Elden Ring, all of which won a metric ton of awards, sold a combined 100 million copies and inspired a monstrous fanbase whose devotion is borderline religious. In little more than a decade and a half, he's transformed his studio FromSoftware into a global juggernaut, laid down the blueprint for an entirely new form of third-person gameplay, redefined how we perceive video game difficulty and online multiplayer, and he's even been declared one of the most influential men alive by Time magazine. He is nothing less than a living video game legend. And yet, amidst all this creative brilliance and critical acclaim and financial success, I think the most fascinating thing about Hidetaka Miyazaki is the absurdly unlikely way that his story began. You see, we have this tendency to view the best video games as these towering artistic achievements that descend from the heavens thanks to divine inspiration, but in reality, that is often not the case. While some games do feel like a creative nuclear bomb going off from the moment they come out, others take years for their impact to be fully appreciated. And nowhere is this more evident than in Miyazaki's first dark fantasy masterpiece, a strange little PlayStation 3 game called Demon Souls. It is a truly beautiful mixture of imagination and immersion, difficulty and reward, complexity and simplicity, all designed to buck every trend that was popular in the late 2000s and realise one man's vision of how video games should make us feel. And yet, it launched to widespread media confusion, a highly disappointed publisher, and opening week sales so low that it should have killed Miyazaki's career right then and there. But obviously, it did not. And instead, Demon Souls would go on to become one of the most influential games of all time, and spark an entire genre's worth of mysterious storytelling, atmospheric world-building, and masochistic game design. So today we're going to unpick this paradox and lay bare the truth at the heart of the nexus. How did a man with no background in game creation end up becoming one of its greatest auteurs? Why did people so profoundly misunderstand his genius when it first appeared on shelves? And what is it that makes the fallen kingdom of Boletaria and the demons that stalk its lands so utterly terrifying and utterly enthralling? This is a video about the nightmare that changed everything. Hidetaka Miyazaki's Demon Souls. Now, before we step through the mist, a few quick things to bear in mind. Firstly, while we're going to do a lot of talking about lore and art direction and system design and all of that juicy video game essay stuff, I'm not trying to cover every little thing that makes up Demon Souls, but rather specifically talk about things that I think are the most important to its lofty legacy. If you think I've missed something that is worth discussing, and I'm sure I will have, as Miyazaki's work is so rich in detail, just drop it down in the comments below, where I am fully expecting to see some pretty interesting theories and ideas. Secondly, I want to say a big thank you to my patrons for keeping the channel alive during such a weird time on YouTube. These days it feels like the website is more interested in endless slop scrolling than in high effort, long form videos. So if you want to support this channel and keep the retrospectives flowing, Patreon is the way to do it. As a little Christmas treat, it's currently half price in December, which means that for just $4, you can watch a whole bunch of exclusive lengthy videos and make sure that some crazy AI algorithm doesn't shut this place down. So with that all out of the way, let's dive into this monster of a video game and heed the call of the Maiden in Black, because deep within the towers of Latria and the pits of Stonefang, there is strength to be granted and a world in need of mending. Almost every great epic starts with a humble origin story, and the tale of how Hidetaka Miyazaki got into the world of video games begins with a childhood that is about as humble as you could possibly imagine. Now, it might be a video essay cliche to start this far back, but I honestly think Miyazaki's early years and the life he led before he joined FromSoftware offer some really interesting insight into the sort of artist he would become. It all begins in September 1974 in Shizuoka Prefecture, where Hidetaka Miyazaki was born into a very loving but also very poor family. Now, this was important for two reasons. The first was that it meant young Miyazaki didn't grow up being exposed to all the same manga, movies and television that his peers were enjoying, because his family couldn't afford them. So instead, he would spend all of his time at the local library. Interestingly, in interviews, he's always claimed to have not been a particularly strong reader, but instead of trying to struggle through complex novels for adults, he'd fill in the gaps he didn't understand with his imagination. And it gave him a real appreciation for storytelling that doesn't necessarily spell everything out. Along with this, you might be surprised to hear that he hardly ever played video games as a child or teenager, as his parents were very suspicious of them and wouldn't allow them in the house, and instead he discovered role-playing through adventure storybooks like Fighting Fantasy, which are sort of like D&D mixed with a choose-your-own-adventure. For young Miyazaki, fantasy wasn't just stories you read or watched on a screen, but a system that you actively participated in, and I think this would prove to be instrumental to his thinking when he eventually began making games. Now, as he'd grown up so poor, when it came time to go to university and get a job, a life in the arts was the last thing on Miyazaki's mind, so he actually went down a pretty traditional career path, studying social science and then getting a job at the database software giant Oracle, where he worked as an account manager for the next 10 years. At this point, he was about as far from the man that we all know today as it is physically possible to be. But it all changed in 2001 when he met up with a few old friends from university. During his time at Oracle, he'd started to really get into video games, spending hours playing A Link to the Past on his Super Nintendo, and eventually becoming obsessed with PC games like Ultima Online and Civilization. But one of his friends turned up with something totally new, a strange PS2 game called Eco. Hidetaka was blown away. Its story was emotional and engrossing despite having no dialogue. The gameplay of protecting a silent princess felt totally distinct from the action games and RPGs he was used to, and the world, with all of its mysterious beauty and opaque lore, totally captivated him. In fact, he was so touched by the experience that within just a few weeks, he had quit his comfortable job at Oracle and had started applying for entry-level positions at any video game company that would have him. Now, it needs to be pointed out that changing jobs is a pretty uncommon thing to do in Japanese culture, as most people join a company and then stay there for their entire lives. But Miyazaki was certain that this was his calling, even if he had absolutely zero experience and could offer nothing beyond raw enthusiasm. Unsurprisingly, most of the big names were more interested in young graduates coming out of the university system, but by a stroke of sheer luck, Miyazaki was hired by a small Tokyo-based developer called FromSoftware. Now, before we take a look at what he actually did when he arrived, we should probably talk about this odd company, because for most people, FromSoftware's history begins with Dark Souls, but they are so much more than that. They'd been founded all the way back in 1986 as a software company by a man named Natoshi Zin, who eventually noticed that video games were getting pretty popular and decided to get in on the action with 1994's Kingsfield. This was a slow-paced first-person dungeon crawler set in a dark fantasy world full of monsters and demons, and it was successful enough that FromSoftware began making games full-time, which led to 3 numbered sequels. Now, this in of itself is a pretty deep rabbit hole, as there is quite a lot of Dark Souls and Elden Ring DNA to be found in those early FromSoft RPGs, but for the sake of this video, we're going to leave that to one side, as it was actually the success of another series that kept the company in business. This was Armored Core, a post-apocalyptic third-person mech game released in 1997, where the player would take control of a highly customizable robot death machine, and then take on a variety of different missions for warring corporate factions. It was a much bigger success than Kingsfield, spawning 2 sequels on the PS1 and then really getting popular on the PS2, where FromSoft produced an absurd 7 different Armored Core games in just 5 years, all of which reviewed somewhat decently and helped keep the money rolling in. As they were still a pretty small company, this allowed them to put together all sorts of other weird experiments, like a pair of survival games called Echo Knight and Kuon, or a dark reimagining of Kingsfield called Shadow Tower, or Otogi, which riffed on the popularity of Devil May Cry and Ninja Gaiden. Amazingly, by the time Hidetaka Miyazaki joined them in 2003, they had released 34 different games. And while they were not particularly well known outside of Japan and never really made anything notable outside of Armored Core, they were still a company with lofty ambitions. So anyway, with zero experience or technical know-how, you might be wondering what exactly Miyazaki could offer, and well, the answer was not very much, as he was assigned to work as a planner on the latest Armored Core game, Last Raven, where he pretty much served as an assistant to whoever needed it. Funnily enough, Miyazaki has consistently said in interviews that this weird role gave him an incredible crash course in video game production, as he spent an entire year learning how to program AI, watching how levels were designed, working out how to create functional menus, digging under the hood in the game's engine, and even helping to write parts of the script and dialogue. Along with this, it quickly turned out that he had a fantastic eye for how all these different parts should link together. And incredibly, despite only being at the company for a single year, he was promoted to director and placed in charge of the next mainline Armored Core game. Obviously, to have risen to this position so quickly was an incredible achievement, but what's even more impressive is that Miyazaki didn't just rest on his laurels. Rather than replicating the things he'd seen in AC Last Raven, he wanted to use AC4 as an opportunity to indulge all his strange creative ideas. And in fact, I think you can see a lot of what would become his iconic style starting to fall into place. For example, one of the first decisions made was to reboot the series' story, and really strip it back, and going with a narrative that was much more open to player interpretation. Similarly, while Armored Core had always been set on a post-apocalyptic Earth, Miyazaki really cranked up the bleak atmosphere, with missions taking place across sprawling liminal deserts or vast washed-out oceans, all of which give the game a real sense of doom, like humanity is fighting over the scraps on a ruined planet. Even in the gameplay, there are little hints of what was to come, as the UI was simplified to keep the focus on the action, and AC4's new combat mechanic, quick boosting, sort of acts as a pseudo-dodge, and makes avoiding damage a much bigger part of the equation. Obviously, with its hyper-fast pace and crazy mech combat, it's still a long way from what Miyazaki would truly become known for. But if you can see glimpses of Dark Souls in the first-person polygonal dungeon crawling of Kingsfield, it's certainly there in the tone and aesthetics of Armored Core 4. Now sadly for Miyazaki, AC4 wasn't a particularly big hit, and it launched to pretty mediocre reviews and disappointing sales numbers. But that wasn't enough to knock the series off its relentless march, and he was immediately put to work on a standalone expansion called Armored Core 4 Answer. This is another pretty interesting proto-Souls game, as despite rolling back many of the artistic decisions in AC4, like its desolate aesthetics and mysterious storytelling style, this is where Miyazaki first dabbled in the world of grand boss fights. Alongside the typical pilot-on-pilot duels which the series had always done, 4 Answer featured battles against arms forts, gigantic mecha fortresses that dwarfed the player and forced you to soar all around them, avoiding their massive firepower, battling with smaller forces, and taking out weak points. It's still some way away from the sort of complex boss design we're going to talk about later, but the arms forts are easily the most memorable part of 4 Answer, and again, it's another example of the Miyazaki style starting to emerge in his earlier works. So even if his career had never gone anywhere else, this story of starting in poverty, not even being allowed to play video games or buy manga, and then somehow managing to become the director of a much beloved series despite coming into the industry a decade late and with zero experience, well, it would be enough to make Miyazaki a legend on its own. But my friends, that is just the start, as here we arrive in Soul Country. So if you thought that an Oracle account manager becoming an established video game director was slightly unlikely, just wait until you hear about the development of Demon's Souls, because really, this game should not exist. It begins with Sony and the PlayStation 3, a console which had a pretty rough start to its life on the market. Not only was the console far too expensive at launch, but its architecture was extremely hard to develop for, and this had the impact of delaying a lot of big releases that would have otherwise driven sales, like Metal Gear Solid, Gran Turismo, and Final Fantasy. In addition to this, multi-platform developers started delaying PS3 versions in favour of the Xbox 360, which had come out 16 months earlier and had eaten a big chunk of PlayStation's North American market, all of which made the executives at Sony start to really panic about what they were going to do. Now in reality, they did eventually right the ship and overtook the 360 in global sales by the end of the generation. But we are concerned with these difficult early years and how Sony was scrambling to get exciting games onto their struggling console. One of the 360's early success stories was Bethesda's Elder Scrolls Oblivion, a groundbreaking role-playing game come fantasy adventure simulator that ended up selling 2 million copies on Microsoft's console, a massive amount considering Western RPGs were typically considered a PC thing rather than something you played on your TV. It caught Sony completely off guard, as at the time they didn't have anything like this planned for the PS3, and it prompted them to go looking for a studio that could produce something similar, a darker fantasy game that was inspired by D&D or the Wheel of Time, rather than Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. The trouble was, in Japan, that didn't leave a lot of options, and so they ended up contacting FromSoftware because they were about the only studio working on the console that had any experience in this area, even if it had been 6 years since the last Kingsfield game. Now, the opportunity to produce a high-profile exclusive that would be published by Sony was far too big for FromSoftware to turn down, but things quickly began to fall apart, as nobody at the studio really had any idea of what they were even trying to make. According to Miyazaki, who was finishing up working on AC for Answer when the project began, the first Demon's Souls prototype was absolutely dreadful, and there was even internal discussion that it might be better to cancel the game and let Sony down than disgrace themselves with such a poor quality release. This is where our hero comes back into the picture, as when Miyazaki heard that the development of FromSoft's dark fantasy RPG was going very badly, he asked if he could take over. As in his own words, nobody could be upset at what I did because the game was already considered a failure. In this respect, he was very much correct, as both FromSoftware's executive team and the publishers at Sony pretty much gave him free rein to do whatever he wanted, which of course resulted in an extremely unique game that was absolutely nothing like the Elder Scrolls. Now, for all the insanity we're going to discuss later in this video, Miyazaki's original aim for Demon's Souls was a pretty straightforward idea. He wanted to make an RPG that took the genre back to basics. And by basics, he meant Wizardry 1, 2, and 3. For those of you who don't know, this was a very early PC RPG series that was particularly popular in Japan, and it involved making a party of different characters and then battling through a huge amount of turn-based combat as you made your way out of a massive dungeon. It was very influential on games like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, but had always remained somewhat niche outside of Japan thanks to its more brutal edge. As combat was extremely difficult, it was full of obtuse systems, it required a ton of grinding to progress, and it even had an autosave function that would preserve all of your mistakes. Funnily enough, Miyazaki loved this and wanted his game to create that same sense of tension and mystery, where you were never sure what fresh doom lay around each corner, or if you would even live through the next fight. Along with this, he was really keen to make sure that the game stayed away from the sort of anime-inspired look that was dominating Japanese RPGs in the mid-2000s, and instead he wanted to make something that felt like Conan the Barbarian or the Tales of King Arthur, a sort of dirty medieval European fantasy full of disturbing monsters, knights caked in dirt, and blood and gore at every turn. Now, during development, this all led to Demon's Souls gaining a reputation amongst the Japanese media as a masochism game, where the sole purpose was to kill the player over and over, but that was not actually the intention, as Miyazaki had always wanted this danger to be balanced out by a peculiar take on console multiplayer. You see, one night as he'd been driving home from Oracle, he'd been caught in heavy snowfall and had gotten stuck on a hill with a bunch of other drivers. After a few minutes, he noticed that people were getting out of their cars and helping to push each one up to the top of the hill, where the owner would jump in and drive off. So he joined in, and eventually it was his turn. But as he drove down the other side of the hill, he realised that he would never see these people again and couldn't thank them for their help. This experience stuck with him for years, and when he took over the Demon's Souls project, he was determined to find a way to turn it into video game form, where people could help each other overcome insurmountable odds, but only ever in passing. So yes, the idea was to make a very punishing game, but also one that was full of little moments of jolly cooperation, where a stranger would step in to save the day and then disappear into the fog. Now, before we get on to what happened when the game was finally finished, we need to take a quick moment to talk about Miyazaki's directorial style, which, just like his origin story, was very unique for a man in his position. Most studios split the work of making a game into distinct teams with specific responsibilities: programmers working on the engine, planners and designers creating gameplay, artists crafting its look, and so on. But Miyazaki didn't much like this structure. He didn't want to become some distant middle manager, and instead set his teams up with a much flatter structure, where developers would often work directly with him, and they would constantly have large meetings where he'd explain his grand ideas to the entire group, rather than just the department leads. This was very unconventional, but Miyazaki's direct involvement went even further, as there were entire sections of the game that he took sole responsibility for, like coming up with the names of places and characters, writing the descriptions of every single item, and amazingly, he personally planned out all of the complex level design. In interviews, he called this way of working total direction, and while it placed him under a huge amount of strain, it also meant that he could craft Demon's Souls into exactly what he wanted, never had to compromise a single part of his vision. In fact, the only time Sony ever made a request of the game was when they fed back that they would like Demon's Souls to feature a heroine, which might help with the marketing. So at a publishing meeting, Miyazaki turned up with the outline of a character called the Maiden in Black, a mysterious woman with wax painted over her eyes who would handle the player's upgrades, which wasn't at all what the publisher had wanted. But Sony producer Ken Kaji liked the idea so much that he lied to his bosses so the game could ship as Miyazaki intended. Essentially, Demon's Souls was a product of sheer serendipity. The right man at the right time, in the right place, with the right people around him. But sadly, when it came time to actually start selling the game, Miyazaki's luck utterly evaporated. The first big blow happened at the Tokyo Game Show in 2008, where FromSoftware showed off their new RPG to the onlooking media, and by all accounts, it proved to be an absolute disaster. Those who even bothered to report on Demon's Souls largely claimed that it was ugly, clunky, and not particularly fun to play, and it was dwarfed in coverage by other big names at the show, like Resident Evil 5, Street Fighter 4, and Dragon Quest 9. If you can believe it, most of the attention at the FromSoftware booth ended up focusing on another game the studio was developing, Ninja Blade, which was intended to be a HD riff on Ninja Gaiden. And thanks to the media response at TGS, it ended up becoming the next big hope for the company, rather than Miyazaki's RPG. As if that wasn't bad enough, a second mortal blow came just a few months later, as the finished version of Demon's Souls was sent to Sony for approval, and their feedback was extremely negative. Apparently, Shuei Yoshida, president of Sony's worldwide studios, sat down with the game and absolutely hated it, famously saying that it was an unbelievably bad game, and this prompted the decision to cancel its publication outside of Japan and heavily reduce its marketing budget. When news of this got back to Miyazaki and his team, they were crushed, and it resulted in opening week sales of just 20,000 copies, a number that was absurdly low even by FromSoftware's modest standards, and pretty much guaranteed that the game would be a massive financial flop. But here's the thing, the story of Demon's Souls does not end there. And over the next few months, something very strange began to happen. It started with the game's initial reviews in Japan, which modern commentators often describe as negative, but really that wasn't the case. For example, Wikipedia shows that Famitsu gave the game a 29 out of 40, which looks terrible until you consider that Famitsu scores are an aggregate of 4 separate 10-scale reviews, and within that 29 there was a 6 from casual gamer Maria Kichi and a 9 from magazine editor Paint Yamamoto. Along with this, other Japanese publications like Dengeki PlayStation and 4Gamer.net were both very positive, giving out 8s and 9s, so while the initial sales numbers were really low, there was also a sense that FromSoftware had made a game worth looking at. Now what's fascinating is that as the months began to tick by, this sentiment began to grow on message boards and on early social media, as people who did play the game were very vocal about its quality, and as this grassroots appreciation continued to grow, so too did the sales numbers. Eventually, Demon's Souls had built enough of a reputation that it began to show up in the Western import scene, which led to a handful of glowing English language reviews, like a towering 9 out of 10 from Eurogamer, who were evangelizing about its quality long before it was ever localized. Bafflingly, Sony were completely oblivious to all of this, and despite sales numbers continuing to climb upwards every single month and a growing buzz online, they still wouldn't publish Demon's Souls outside of Japan, a crazy decision that Shuei Yoshida has gone on to claim was one of the biggest mistakes of his career. Thankfully, other publishers weren't quite as foolish, and in mid-2009, a deal was struck between FromSoft and Atlus, the company behind Megami Tensei and Persona, where they would localize the game into English and then release it in North America. This led to a really great showing at that year's E3 and a good deal of hype online, which eventually translated into a raft of very positive reviews, with all sorts of popular outlets like IGN, Game Trailers, GameSpot, 1UP and Edge magazine all giving it a near perfect score. Now it does have to be said that compared to the truly big hitters of 2009, Wii Sports, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, Assassin's Creed 2 and Resident Evil 5, Demon's Souls was still a pretty niche release. By 2011, after 2 years on the market, it had sold just over 1 million copies worldwide. But when you view this in its proper context, that it began life as a failed experiment that was close to being cancelled, that it was taken over by a creative madman trying to buck every popular trend, and that its publisher absolutely hated it and refused to put any money behind its marketing, well, it's a miracle that this game even exists at all, let alone that people actually recognised what Miyazaki was trying to do. So, if that's the story of how Demon's Souls came into being, we now need to change gear and take a look at what it is about this game that allowed this incredible turnaround to happen. It might feel like the reasons are obvious, as after all this is the game that spawned our collective Souls-like obsession, but the truth is that Demon's Souls is still a very unique game even within its own family, and can still surprise and terrify all these years later. Now there is a lot to discuss if we're going to try and unpick what makes Demon's Souls so special, but I want to start with how the game presents its narrative, because it's really rather different from what people have come to expect from Hidetaka Miyazaki. You see, he has developed something of a signature style, where his games typically open with a cutscene full of confusing terms and names, and then don't really ever explain anything outright, leaving it up to the player to come to their own conclusions about what is going on. You can draw clues from the way the environments have been put together, read the descriptions of hundreds of different items, and try to decipher mysterious NPC dialogue, but broadly speaking, you're not really being told a story so much as you're exploring a world. Now, it is true that this narrative style has its roots in Demon's Souls, but it is actually a far more straightforward story than you might expect, and it starts with an opening sequence that is about as traditional as an RPG can get. The first thing we see when we boot up the game is a CGI cutscene, one that starts with an almost biblical statement, that on the first day man was granted a soul, and on the second day, upon the earth was placed a soul-devouring demon. Essentially, while mankind might be strong and clever and capable, in the world of Demon Souls, we are not the hunters, but the hunted. This is on show in the rest of the cutscene, where we see a knight battling a fierce demonic horde, receiving aid from a mysterious blue phantom, and then, in the moment of their victory, a monstrous dragon appears overhead and presumably scorches them to a crisp. Obviously, it tells us nothing substantial about the story of this game, but it does do a great job of setting the tone, which is one of danger, destruction, and horror, where brave knights don't go on noble adventures but are cruelly slain by terrible monsters. Now, this is followed up by the real introductory cutscene, a classic combination of dramatic narration and still images, which veterans of Dark Souls and Elden Ring will find very familiar, and it is here that we find the premise of Demon Souls. The game takes place in a large kingdom called Boletaria, ruled by King Alant XII, who was able to make his land rich and powerful thanks to the discovery of the magic of soul arts. Now, for a while, this made Boletaria a paradise, until one day a colourless grey fog began to creep across the land, slowly cutting the kingdom off from its neighbours and claiming the lives of any who dared enter. The narrator tells us that eventually someone managed to break free from within, a knight called Valafax of the Royal Fangs, and he revealed that inside the grey mists, Boletaria had fallen. The king's insatiable greed for magical power had caused him to awaken the Old One, a vast demonic monster that he had hoped to tame, but which instead had begun spewing out a thick, colourless fog. Wherever the fog touched, horrible demons would soon follow, and very quickly, the people of Boletaria were either consumed or driven mad, and the kingdom fell into chaos. Now, the trouble was that Valafax also revealed that the demons were consuming souls in order to strengthen themselves, but it was discovered that this transaction went both ways, as if a demon could be killed, its soul could be absorbed, and the holder would gain immeasurable power. This kick-started a sort of demonic gold rush, where heroes, knaves, wizards and vagabonds all converged on the fog-covered ruins of Boletaria, looking to claim the souls of demons and write their names into history. We play as one such adventurer, a fool who arrives on the outskirts of the kingdom and is almost immediately killed by a monstrous foe known as the Vanguard. But instead of disappearing into the abyss, we awaken in a holy shrine called the Nexus. Here we meet the Maiden in Black, Miyazaki's heroine, who tells us that we are now trapped between life and death, and that the only way to escape this fate is to head through a set of portals called Archstones, where we must slay the demons we find within. This is our ultimate goal: to slay monsters, to acquire power, and to eventually break free from our curse of undeath. Now, in truth, there is a lot more detail to discover about this crumbling world, but I want to take a moment to point out just how accessible this narrative really is, and how it results in a game with very clear objectives. There is no wandering around while trying to get your bearings, no stumbling into terrifying late-game dead ends, no esoteric conversations with NPCs that you don't really understand, and importantly, no need to look anything up online. Just a simple and straightforward quest to defeat the biggest demons that you can find. In many ways, it's completely antithetical to the types of stories that were dominating RPGs in the late 2000s. Vast epics that concern themselves with hundreds of named characters, thousands of years worth of backstory, and endless unique fantasy terms, all of which Demon Souls rejects in favour of old-school simplicity. Now, importantly, that doesn't mean that Demon Souls lacks narrative depth, and actually it has some really cool lore underpinning its world, but it's just that you have to do a bit of digging to find it. For example, a few hours after our quest begins, the Maiden in Black invites us up to the rafters of the Nexus to meet with the Last Monumental, a strange cult of mystics who can offer us some insight. She tells us that everything that is happening in Boletaria has happened before. The waking of the Old One, the colourless fog, and the hordes of demons, and that actually this forms part of a natural cycle, where human greed causes them to meddle with powers beyond their understanding, and great heroes step forward to save them. In her time, this was the Order of the Monumentals, but they are now all dead, which means it falls to us to acquire enough power that we might stand before the Old One, which will allow the Maiden to lull it back to sleep. Considering the classic narrative meme that RPGs always end with you killing God, this is a surprisingly subversive take on the genre, and I think it is a fascinating piece of storytelling, as Miyazaki is telling us up front that we aren't really saving the world. Our actions in Boletaria only serve to postpone the slaughter to another day, and while I think many players will completely brush past this, in truth, it is quite the horrifying revelation. This dynamic is at the core of everything that Demon's Souls is trying to do. Seemingly simple concepts that mask a surprising amount of complexity. While we're going to explore this idea in many more ways, I think it is a huge part of why the storytelling works. You can treat this like Final Fantasy or Dragon Age, hunting down snippets of lore, poring over item descriptions, examining every inch of the world and trying to piece together its history. Or it can be like Ninja Gaiden or Doom, where the narrative is simply an aesthetic backdrop for all the action and chaos. The beauty of Demon's Souls is that it works as either one of these, riding the line between old school accessibility and modern cinematic design, in a way that nobody had ever really tried before. So with our quest established, let's take a look at the world in which all this takes place, because the various environments of Boletaria are presented to us in a very odd structure, one that isn't just distinct from future Miyazaki games, but pretty much everything else on the market in the late 2000s. If you cast your mind back to the 7th generation, you'll likely recall that it was the era of the open world game, where many big companies began adapting the Grand Theft Auto formula with pretty massive success. In the space of just a few years, we got Assassin's Creed, Fallout, Fable, Far Cry, and so many others, all of which were based around a specific type of sandbox free roam gameplay, where the player chose between lots of different potential objectives and often made their own fun. Now, at the very same time this was happening, more linear series like Halo, Uncharted, God of War, and Bioshock were starting to present themselves as more cohesive cinematic experiences, where ideas like segregated levels separated by loading screens were becoming a thing of the past, and games were starting to flow from one high-impact scene to the next. Essentially, the sort of highly defined structure used by the 2D classics of the past had been finally left behind. And this is what makes Demon's Souls such a curious game. You see, rather than embracing either of these trends, Miyazaki and his team opted for their own unique approach. A curious mixture of highly segregated game spaces and total player freedom. An odd blend of linearity and open design that still feels very novel today. The way it works is that dotted around the Nexus are 5 archstones, each of which takes you to 5 separate locations: the Boletarian Palace, Stonefang Tunnel, the Towers of Latria, the Shrine of Storms, and the Valley of Defilement, each of which has its own distinct look, its own unique mechanics, and a powerful archdemon that we are trying to slay. Now, the process of doing this is pretty straightforward, as each of the environments is split into 3 or 4 entirely linear levels, each of which need to be defeated in order to unlock the next, and each of which always ends with a climactic end-level boss. Much like in the game's storytelling, it is a refreshingly old-school approach to video game structure, but it actually really works for a few different reasons. The first is that it gives you a real sense of clarity about what you're supposed to be doing. As there isn't a defined order in which you need to take down the archdemons, you simply walk over to your archstone of choice, load into whatever level you've unlocked, and then battle your way to a boss, which upon defeat unlocks a new level where you can begin on your next visit. A process that makes it very hard to lose track of where you should be going. Similarly, because you always have 5 different paths available, it's tough to get truly walled off from making any progress. As if you ever get stuck on a particularly tricky boss or find yourself in a level that you genuinely can't beat, you can simply head back to the Nexus and start on something else. This freedom of choice is essentially what makes open world games so compelling, so it's actually quite interesting to see a game try to replicate the idea without the structure. And in a funny sort of way, it reminds me of Mega Man's Robot Masters, where the order of the levels can change wildly depending on your personal preference. Now, it should also be said that despite this fairly rigid structure, Demon's Souls' 5 worlds aren't quite as segmented as people often make out, and there has clearly been a lot of work poured into making them feel cohesive. For example, in Stonefang Tunnel, you begin the first level on the outside of a vast mine, and then battle your way down through the facility and into a boss fight against a large armoured spider. Once it's been defeated, you unlock a checkpoint and the next level, a sprawling labyrinth of caves and tunnels which takes you away from the mine and into the depths of the earth, a dark and dangerous place where you come face to face with a vicious nightmare called the Flame Lurker. The thing is, there's nothing stopping you from running all the way from the Flame Lurker back up through the last 2 levels to the top of the mine. And while Stonefang is separated by archstone checkpoints, it is also a cohesive, singular environment. This is true of every other archstone. As in Boletaria, you could stand on the ramparts of the palace and look back over the walls you climbed in the earlier levels. And likewise, in Latria and the Shrine of Storms, you see future levels off in the distance long before you ever arrive there. Obviously, it is still a long way from the vast interconnected worlds that people would eventually come to expect from Hidetaka Miyazaki, but it's still so much more than just a collection of linear levels, and that's before we even talk about the art direction and the atmosphere. This is where Demon's Souls truly shines, because thanks to its tightly designed nature, there is very little wasted space. We're constantly being thrust into memorable locations that use all sorts of compelling architecture and clever sound design. Let's start with the art and aesthetics, as each of the 5 archstones has a very different look, with Boletaria acting as the traditional fantasy medieval setting, Stonefang taking place entirely underground, Latria being a sort of nightmare Lovecraftian prison, the shrine formed out of ancient graveyards atop a vast mountain, and finally, the valley, which is a dark swamp filled with disease and decay. This theming plays into everything from the bosses to the enemies and even mechanics unique to the levels. But the simple thing that I have always loved is how FromSoft uses bold colour to make their levels stand out from one another. Where Boletaria is a grounded collage of greys and blues created by the sturdy granite of the castle and the open sky above, the valley is a sickly blend of browns, reds and blacks, as shadows and swamp water blur into one in the murky distance. Just like how the structure creates a sense of clarity about where you can go, this approach to visual design does the same, as it makes it extremely hard to confuse the levels, as you'll easily be able to remember that horrible monster you couldn't defeat in the gothic greens of Latria, or the eerie blue eyes of the undead stalking your progress in the Shrine of Storms. Now on top of this, the levels themselves are quite cleverly laid out, and often have a lot more gameplay variety than you might expect from a hardcore action RPG. In Boletaria, there's a level where we have to avoid the flames of a dragon, who will come screaming out of the sky if we step foot onto an open walkway, and the whole point is to work out when it's safe to run between cover, or if there are alternative paths that can hide us from its view. Likewise, in the valley, in one level we have to journey across a vast swamp, where the poisonous waters prevent us from rolling, a monstrous handicap that forces you to approach combat in a totally different way, and turns even the most basic of encounters into a terrifying life or death struggle. There are highly scripted levels that prioritise combat, others that are much more open and reward exploration, some that are based around finding specific items or chasing down a particular enemy, and even some that will open up new sections depending on your actions elsewhere in the game. At the risk of repeating myself, just like with the structure and the aesthetics, it's a level of creativity that wasn't common in 7th generation RPGs, where environments were often little more than a static canvas for endless repetitive combat, or a hallway intended to take you to the next cutscene. Now the final point I'd like to make about the world of Demon's Souls relates to its music, as it is here that we see a real break from tradition and Miyazaki doing something very unusual. Incredibly, Demon's Souls is almost entirely silent, and while you're exploring its various domains, the only sounds you'll hear are the faint ambience of the environment around you, like constant falling rain in the valley or winds blowing over the mountain in the Shrine of Storms. This is extremely unconventional for an RPG, where typically every single second of gameplay is accompanied by some form of music. But the thing is, this near silence creates an absolutely gripping atmosphere, as it sucks your focus into the world and makes every distant noise a moment of tension and discomfort. Now what's really clever is that despite this, there is actually a fair amount of music in Demon's Souls, but it only plays at key moments and only does so to draw out very specific emotions. For example, there is a slow-paced string piece that plays every time we return to the Nexus, endlessly looping in a warm bath of gentle chords that is clearly meant to make you feel safe and protected from the horrors behind the archstones. On the flip side, each of the bosses has their own unique theme, and these are a lot more intense, combining all manner of drums, horns, strings, and even choral music, all of which leads to pulsing and chaotic songs that ramp up the intensity of facing down a powerful monster. Incredibly, this is all achieved with just a single hour of recorded music, and real credit needs to go to its composer, Shunsuke Kida, who had only ever scored music for TV before joining the project, and had absolutely no experience with the world of video games. Thanks to Miyazaki's strange vision of how music should complement his work, Kida ended up producing one of the most unique soundtracks in video game history, and to this day he is still replying to people on Twitter thanking him for his work. Again, all of this is yet another example of that simplicity masking complexity dynamic that we spoke about earlier. How on the surface, Demon's Souls looks like a throwback to the sort of video game design you remember from the 1990s, but is actually twisting it in creative and fresh new ways. It's rigidly segmented, but it's also full of player freedom. It's tightly linear, but there is also a vast world to explore. It's silent, but it's also full of music. It's intimidating and foreboding, while also luring you deeper with every small step you take. In truth, Demon's Souls was simply unlike anything else you could buy in 2009, and I think this is why it resonated so hard with critics and enthusiasts, because for the first time in what felt like a decade, someone had dared to do things differently. But my friends, while all that might be true of the game's storytelling, structure, visuals and music, we are yet to get onto the game's real claim to fame. That's right, it's time to talk about difficulty. When it comes to any game made by FromSoftware and Hidetaka Miyazaki, it feels like the conversation almost always descends into endless debates about difficulty. Which boss killed you the most times? Which enemy ambush or deadly surprise caught you out? Should there be an easy mode? Should you be able to pause? Is it right to beat a boss with summons or another player helping? How many times did you quit, only to come crawling back a few hours later? Well, all of this began back with Demon's Souls, and despite Miyazaki's lofty design ideals, it was the game's surprisingly high level of difficulty that really cut through with the media and made people pay attention. You see, in the late 2000s, there was a growing feeling that video games had been getting much easier, and were increasingly focusing on spectacle, storytelling, and player empowerment, rather than trying to pose a stiff challenge. Now, while there were still games like Devil May Cry and Ninja Gaiden, and a growing class of tough indies like Spelunky and Braid, there was a lot of truth to the observation. Not only had Nintendo pivoted an entire chunk of the industry towards casual gaming with the Wii, the development in general was starting to become very expensive, and this made publishers pretty averse to anything that might put off mainstream buyers. If you were funding a game to the tune of $50 million, it made no sense to make it so hard that people would never see the credits, and this meant that a lot of little difficulty concessions started to creep into the world of AAA gaming. At first, it was things like more frequent checkpoints or difficulty modes that you could change on the fly, but by 2009, developers were going much further and started including things like a button that would tell you exactly where to go, like in Fable 2 and Dead Space, or even removing failure altogether, as Ubisoft did in Prince of Persia 2008. Basically, the idea was that dying over and over again was something that you found in old school dollar-munching arcade games, or in online multiplayer if you weren't very good, whereas single-player games were meant to be about wish fulfillment and feeling like a hero. Demon's Souls came out of nowhere and completely blew apart this mentality, proving conclusively that there was a sizable market for video games where you did not feel powerful, where you did not always make progress, and where you really had to push yourself to overcome its challenges. It was unlike anything else on the market at the time, so I think it's important that we take a good long look at just how hard this game actually was and why it works so well. Now for me, difficulty comes in two distinct flavours: mechanical and systemic. Mechanical difficulty is how hard it is to actually play the game, and refers to things like timing button presses, avoiding different failed states, dealing with increasingly complex obstacles, having to have fast reactions, and generally asking the player to master physical actions in order to progress. It's a concept that has been around since the industry began, and if you've ever tried to beat Castlevania or Ghosts and Goblins, you'll know very well that there is a huge amount of frustration and reward to be found in mechanically difficult video games. On the other hand, systemic difficulty is a bit more abstract, and is typically found in role-playing or strategy games, where the difference between a high-skill player and a low-skill player isn't found in how fast they can do things, but in how well they understand its concepts. A great example is Vagrant Story, which is a somewhat straightforward third-person dungeon crawler that rests atop a mountain of interlocking numbers and systems, all of which impact combat in some form, and all of which need to be considered every time you step into battle. Now, what makes Demon's Souls so unique is not just that it was very challenging at a time when games were becoming easier, but that it is one of the few games that delivers both of these kinds of difficulty. So let's start with the mechanical side of things, because it's the most immediately obvious, and is present from the moment you boot up the game. At first glance, Demon's Souls seems like any other third-person action game, as it's built upon a host of player actions that will feel very familiar. You can lock on to an enemy, you have a choice between a light or heavy attack, you can block if you have a shield equipped, you can dodge away from enemy strikes, and you can use items. Nothing particularly crazy, right? Well, the first layer of complexity comes from the controls. As while you move with the left stick and control the camera with the right, everything beyond this is a little strange, and it tends to stump a lot of newer players. In the bottom left of the screen you have 4 item slots, with spells at the top, consumable items at the bottom, and 2 slots on either side of your left and right hand, which can be scrolled through by using the D-pad. This system dictates what your other buttons will do, as if you're holding a weapon in your right hand, R1 and R2 will do different attacks. If you're holding a shield, holding L1 will block, and if you equip a talisman or wand, this enables you to cast whatever spell is set to the top slot. It is actually quite an intuitive system, but thanks to the fact that it was so different to anything else, people initially really struggled, likely not helped by the fact that key face buttons on your controller do quite peculiar things, like triangle switching to a 2-hand stance and X using items. This means that a big part of the mechanical challenge comes from just learning how to control your character. But it gets a lot more complex than that, as not only do you need to master what to do, but when to do it. You see, Demon's Souls is a very deliberate game, and thanks to the fact that most attacks have a short wind-up, and that you can't cancel out of them once triggered, the punishment for making a mistake or mistiming a move is far higher than in most other action games. You can only sustain a handful of hits before your character dies, maybe even as few as 1 or 2 from a particularly large foe. In turn, enemies can take a fair bit of punishment and often attack in small groups or in ambushes. Blocking uses up your stamina, so you can't hide behind a shield and outlast opponents, and to put it bluntly, you have to get to grips with the methodical flow of combat very quickly. If you go in looking to swing your weapons wildly, like in Dynasty Warriors or God of War, you're going to end up dying a lot. So the aim is to take your time, watch for enemy attack patterns, and really understand when your character can take advantage and when they can't. Now, as if this wasn't already enough to contend with, Demon's Souls gameplay also sits atop a sort of pseudo-class system, where how you play is dictated by your stats and equipment, and broadly slots into a few different categories. There are heavily armoured knights that sit behind heavy shields and are slow to move around, fast-paced ninjas that live on the edge, dodging every attack and dishing out huge damage at lightning speed, casters that can fight from range but die very quickly when cornered, and priests that can stay in battle for much longer thanks to powerful heals and buffs. When you consider that there are also 18 different classes of weapon, each of which have their own unique movesets, and that each world can have as many as 15 different types of enemies, all with their own movesets. And well, you can start to see how there are a lot of combat variables that you need to get your head around. This on its own would be enough to make Demon's Souls a very tough challenge, but it's all cranked up by what happens when you die, as this isn't your typical action brawler where you just reload at a checkpoint and have another go. Death in Boletaria is very punishing, as you not only lose half of your max health bar, which can only be recovered by defeating a boss, but you also drop all of your unspent money and experience points, and are sent back to the very start of the level with all of the enemies respawning. To add to this, there are no difficulty modes you can change between, there is a frequent autosave which locks in your mistakes, and the game doesn't pause when you open a menu, so if you aren't hyper focused on what you're doing, you're going to get your ass absolutely beat. I will freely admit, when I first played Demon's Souls back in 2009, I initially thought this was all utterly ridiculous, as I had never played a game that had this little contempt for my desire to make progress. But the thing is, the more I died, the more I realised that I had actually played many games like this before. You see, the trick is to not think about Demon's Souls like a 3D action game or even an RPG, but like an old school platformer. Something like Castlevania or Mega Man, where the goal isn't to level up or defeat enemies, but to fail over and over as you learn the levels inside out. As with many things in this video, this might seem obvious in a post-Elden Ring world, but at the time it was a really strange way to think about a 3D action RPG with stats and equipment. But if you can get into this headspace, the mechanical difficulty and endless failures can take you to some incredible places. The first is that by making progress so hard fought, Demon's Souls is filled with moments of utter elation. When you finally beat a level that has been kicking your ass for hours, or slay a boss that felt impossible on your first attempt, it really cannot be understated just how satisfying it feels, and it creates this constant conveyor belt of achievement that other games don't really have. Sure, you might get a small hit of dopamine when you solve a puzzle in Resident Evil or beat a boss in Zelda, but it's nothing compared to the triumph you feel in Dark Souls, and that is entirely because the game is as hard as it is and offers you no way to get around the challenge. Now, this is quite a well discussed phenomenon and has become quite a normal part of game design in the last decade or so, but there is actually a lot more that the mechanical challenge brings to the table than just a sense of accomplishment. I think a really underrated aspect is that it gives the game a terrifying horror-like atmosphere, as not only do you feel very weak, which is the natural requirement for any game trying to scare you, but the risk of losing your health bar, resources and progress creates legitimate risk, which FromSoft can then toy with. It's best on show in the Towers of Latria, which begin with the player creeping around the maze-like corridors of a shadowy prison, surrounded by shrunken convicts screaming in pain, bloody torture devices filled with corpses, and worst of all, the disgusting Lovecraftian jailers. These monsters prowl the hallways looking for escapees, and when they discover one, namely you, they'll launch a barrage of powerful magical attacks or drain your life force with their horrible mandibles. Unless you have purposefully left Latria until much later in the game, they are a seriously dangerous foe, and this creates an awful atmosphere of fear as you desperately try to get out of the prison while slowly becoming more and more lost. In fact, FromSoft even builds on this emotion by giving them bells that you can hear ringing out in the silence, which means you'll often hear a jailer long before you can see it. A classic horror trope that could have been lifted straight from Resident Evil, and only works because the game is so damn hard. Now, another underappreciated aspect of its difficulty is how Demon's Souls creates a sense of distance. Something that is quite strange to talk about, but which plays a huge role in how the levels feel to explore. You see, one of the game's defining challenges is that there is absolutely zero guidance about where you should be going. No waypoints that point you towards an objective, no helpful NPCs that say the boss is just up ahead, no inter-level checkpoints that indicate you're heading in the right direction, and most importantly, no in-game map. This was another real break from contemporary game design that many players struggled with, especially as there are certain levels, like the swamp in the Valley of Defilement, the tunnels in Stonefang, and the Latrian prisons that can get very confusing if you don't have a good nose for directions. But just like everything else we've discussed in this chapter, there is a very positive trade-off, as it creates an amazing sense of scale, where the safety of the Nexus feels like a distant memory, and you're desperately trying to map out this world and remember key locations. In fact, this leads to one of Demon's Souls' most satisfying and simplest ideas, that of the shortcut, where hours of hard work are rewarded with a bridge or a ladder that allow you to skip the pain next time around. And let me tell you, finding one of these is just as rewarding as any victory over a boss. Again, it only works because the game is so unrelentingly challenging, and I think it's important that we recognise the difficulty isn't just about asking the player to tap buttons in the correct order, but that it is a tool that can be used to create all sorts of clever emotions. But the thing is, that is only half the picture, as we still need to talk about the game's systemic difficulty, and how hard it is to understand some of Miyazaki's more obtuse ideas. For everything we have just talked about, Demon's Souls is still at its heart an RPG. And that means all of the tension-filled action sits atop a pretty massive pile of confusing numbers and interlocking systems. This is where we find the game's systemic difficulty, and unlike its more in-your-face cousin, it can be a real doozy to try and unpick. Now, before we dive into all the numbers and statistics and hidden metrics, it does need to be said that a lot of this difficulty comes from unfamiliarity, as Demon's Souls was so unlike any other RPG people have played that it naturally carried with it a degree of confusion. You see, at this time, RPGs were built upon a kind of universal language, where it didn't really matter if you were picking up Lost Odyssey or Fallout 3 or Dragon Age Origins, you would always have some sort of idea of how the game was going to work. In its simplest expression, it's things like, if you defeat enemies, you gain XP and level up, or you can get stronger by equipping new gear, or even something as simple as you buy items from the merchants in town. The truth is that while Demon's Souls does have a lot of these foundational RPG ideas, they're often presented in very weird ways, with lots of added layers of complexity. And thanks to this, I think a lot of the game's systemic challenge is found in just trying to understand it. Let's start with your resources, because the way that Demon's Souls treats both money and XP are very novel. You see, rather than acquiring XP from defeating enemies, which automatically levels you up, and collecting money from their corpses, which you then spend on items or equipment, these two concepts have been rolled into a single currency, souls, which drops in differing amounts from every fallen foe and can be found in varying sized consumables out in the world. Souls are the lifeblood of the economy in Boletaria, and everything from repairing your equipment to buying restorative items or gaining new spells all requires souls. And considering how much you'll be dying, you'll need a steady income in order to refill your inventory after each trip into an Archstone. Now, the trouble with this is that souls are also how you increase your character's power, as leveling up is a manual process that requires you to speak to the Maiden in Black, and then spend an ever-increasing amount to bump up one of 8 stats. This creates an obvious dilemma. Do you spend your souls replacing items, or do you save up to increase your overall strength? Problem that is all the more stark as the game's high mechanical difficulty makes holding onto your souls a pretty tough proposition. To make matters even more confusing, what stats you need to upgrade totally depend on the class you are playing. But as there is nothing actually restricting your build, it's pretty easy for newer players to get lost in the weeds, overwhelmed by all the different things that you can spend souls on. You obviously need more health, so you upgrade vitality, but you also want more stamina, so you'll want to upgrade endurance. Then again, more damage is always good, but you upgrade strength or dexterity. If you're playing as a caster, you'll want to invest in either magic or faith, but then you'll also need to improve your intelligence in order to have enough mana. It's a lot to think about, and while the game does outline pretty clearly what all the stats do, without some additional guidance, it's pretty typical for new players to end up with a very mediocre character who doesn't excel at anything and is far too weak for the late game levels. Now, as if that already wasn't complex enough, the game's approach to equipment is very peculiar, because you're not really following a traditional linear progression of starting with a wooden sword and then replacing it with an iron one, and then a steel one, and so on. As we've already mentioned, you choose your weapon based on its moveset, rather than its damage numbers, and the idea is that you can stick with this for the entire game as long as you upgrade it and keep its power steadily increasing. This in of itself isn't that hard to understand, but the method by which we do it certainly is, and this brings us onto Demon's Souls' extremely odd crafting system. Now at first, nothing seems amiss, as there is a blacksmith inside the Nexus called Baldwin, and if we talk to him, we can select the option to upgrade our items, and see clearly that in order to increase their damage or armor rating, we need to pay a small amount of souls and give him either hard stones or sharp stones. This denotes if it's a strength or dexterity weapon, and thankfully in the very first level of Stonefang Tunnel, which you'll likely head to quite early in the game, you find these stones in abundance, and thus can improve the quality of your gear. The trouble is, this is only a very small part of the crafting ecosystem, and in reality, if you want access to the game's more powerful weapons, you'll need to hunt down a completely different blacksmith called Ed, who is hidden away in a secret room in Stonefang Tunnel. Here you can have Ed give your weapons a bunch of different effects, which depend on the type of stone you give him. And these range from adding bleed or poison damage with Sucker Stone or Mercury Stone, to adding HP regen with a Blessed Stone, or even things like adding massive strength modifiers with a Grey Stone. Now, if these were just additions to the upgrades done by Baldwin, it would be fairly manageable. But instead, the way it works is that you have to upgrade a weapon in the Nexus to either +3 or +6, which then will allow Ed to transform it into an entirely different weapon with the new properties, which then has to be upgraded on its own separate path. Knowing how and when you should do this is really unclear, and to make matters even more obtuse, finding the correct materials is a real ordeal, as there are 14 different types of upgrade stone split into 3 different types of quality that are all scattered across every single level. The system is almost impossible to decipher without looking anything up online, but as it's the difference between doing a decent amount of damage and doing no damage, it's hard to give this the typical Souls explanation that there is somehow satisfaction in the struggle. Funnily enough, this is true of another couple of concepts that I really think should be more clearly telegraphed, like how there are 3 different speeds of dodge and 2 different sprint speeds, which depend on the weight of the armour that you are wearing. The classic response here is that the system is intuitive, because, of course, you'd be faster while wearing lighter clothes, but I'm not really sure what is to be gained from purposefully hiding that information, as if we hover over the equip weight stat, the only information we get is that movement is slowed when overburdened. This doesn't explain anything about the mechanic, and is actually even more confusing as there is another player state called overburdened, which is when your inventory is full, and this has nothing to do with rolling or sprinting. To be honest, I think a lot of people look at these more opaque systems and retroactively try to justify them with the benefit of multiple sequels and years of community knowledge. But the cold hard truth is that without all this, Demon's Souls would be a damn complicated game to work out. In fact, this brings us onto the game's most notorious system, a particularly baffling idea that was immediately cut from Demon's Souls' successors and remains a real point of contention even to this day. This is world tendency, a system whereby the state of different levels shifts depending on your actions. Given it's right there on the main menu, next to incredibly important information like your inventory, your character sheet and your equipment, you'd think this would be an ever-present in your playthrough, but weirdly, you can go hours and hours and hours, maybe even all the way to the credits, without ever noticing it. The way it works is that all the worlds begin in neutral tendency, and if you defeat a level boss, it will shift one step towards white tendency, while dying in human form, which is when your health bar is full, shifts it one step towards black. This is important because if a world gets to maximum white tendency, enemies will be much easier to kill but will drop less souls, while in maximum black tendency, enemies are more numerous, they have much more health, they do more damage, and they drop more souls. Now this presents a pretty big problem, because most players will not want their worlds to fall into black tendency, but outside of seeing the archstones in the main menu growing darker or brighter, there is no in-game explanation for any of this, so plenty of players have no idea it's even happening. As there is a real temptation to play in human form, so you have more health, it's very easy for newcomers to accidentally find themselves trapped in a black tendency nightmare, and it has led to a very strange tactic being adopted by veterans. Essentially, every time you defeat a boss, you run up to the top of the nexus and throw yourself to your doom, which yes, halves your health, but importantly means you cannot accidentally shift the world tendency of any of the levels, and overall, it makes the game much easier. Obviously, this was not the intention of Miyazaki and his team, who wanted the game to have this push and pull between the benefits of using human form and the risks of black world tendency. But it just doesn't work in practice, and it's so poorly communicated that even the players who do understand it end up ignoring it altogether. Ultimately, I think this is why it's so rare to see this combination of mechanical and systemic difficulty, because really they pull in opposite directions and ask completely different things from the player. Most RPGs can lean into numbers, stats and systems because the gameplay is quite simplistic, and for more complex action games that ask a lot of your reflexes, there isn't much to think about beyond what is happening on screen. Demon's Souls is a unique attempt to marry the two together, but really I think it's come to be defined by the excitement and tension in the mechanical half rather than in its complex web of systems. And really, this makes sense, because if you come up against a sequence of gameplay that you can't seem to beat, or a boss that feels impossible, you can mix up your tactics, dodging at different points, trying out different attacks, or even just heading into a different part of the game. On the flip side of things, if you don't understand how to spend your souls, or can't work out how to craft a weapon, or accidentally end up in pure black tendency, there isn't really anything you can do without turning to the internet and having someone explain it. Now importantly, this doesn't mean that you can't have fun with the systems in Demon's Souls, and once you understand them, there is a lot of depth to pick over. But I think it's telling that as FromSoftware continued to make these sorts of games, they increasingly shied away from this sort of design. Bloodborne, Sekiro and Elden Ring, all of these have much higher mechanical difficulty, but are also a lot easier to understand. And while they have their fair share of strange systems, none of them are quite as confusing or obtuse as those found in Demon's Souls. So I think by this point, it's pretty obvious that Demon's Souls played a very important role in reversing an industry-wide shift towards over-the-top power fantasy and passive cinematic style design. In short, it reminded everyone that overcoming a big challenge was satisfying in its own right. And you can see echoes of this in everything from modern indie games to AAA blockbusters. But my friends, that is not the only place where Miyazaki's fiendish RPG made waves, as there is another aspect of this game's design that would prove to be incredibly influential, one that draws upon the oldest traditions of the industry. This is where we're going to talk about Demon's Souls bosses, because despite the game's online reputation originally coming from the high challenge and confusing systems, it is these climactic moments that truly defined its legacy. Now, in order to properly understand why this was such a big deal, we need to once again remind ourselves of the lay of the land, because in the late 2000s, the very concept of the boss fight had become a little unfashionable. As we've already discussed, the 7th generation was the time of the grand cinematic shooter and the vast open world game, two genres that don't really have much space for mechanically complex boss fights. And even in the world of RPGs, where boss fights had always played a big role, high-profile series like Mass Effect, Fable and The Elder Scrolls were using them less and less. While they still very much existed, especially in Japanese series like Final Fantasy, Devil May Cry, Monster Hunter and Metal Gear Solid, it was no longer a given that every single video game level would end with its own unique boss. This is what makes Hidetaka Miyazaki's style so interesting, because not only was this the exact structure that he wanted Demon's Souls to revolve around, but he was desperate to make sure that his bosses were far more than just obstacles with big health bars. In an interview with Polygon in 2015, Miyazaki once said that the way he approached boss design was to think of them as characters rather than enemies. Rather than obsessing over movesets or tactics, Miyazaki was concerned with things like if the monster tied into the themes of the story, or if it felt like it had a history outside of the encounter, and ultimately, along with some very inventive game design, this philosophy would lead to FromSoftware creating some of the most memorable and beloved boss fights of all time. But here's the thing. This reputation largely began with Dark Souls in 2011, Demon's Souls' spiritual successor that built on many of its best ideas. So I think we need to take a step back and work out what was happening in 2009. Now, rather uncharitably, many people describe Demon's Souls' approach to boss design as revolving around gimmicks, something that is both true but also sort of misrepresents what FromSoftware were going for. For example, the game's very first boss is the Phalanx, a gooey blob of shields and spears that slowly moves around the Boletarian gatehouse while being protected by a host of smaller minions. It's fairly resistant to all forms of damage, but throughout the preceding level you can find Turpentine, which adds fire damage to your weapon, and quite a few handheld firebombs, which generally indicate that this might be the boss's weakness and provide a way to do decent damage. In reality, the so-called Gimmick is more of a tactical riddle, that the Phalanx is vulnerable to fire, and for players that can work this out, they'll have a pretty easy time, while those that don't end up struggling. This mode of thinking is what is being asked of you every time you step into a boss fight, and it can often revolve around much more obscure ideas than elemental weaknesses. Take the Adjudicator, a swollen butcher that sits in the tombs below the first level of the Shrine of Storms and has a single weak point, a golden bird that sits atop its crown, well out of the reach of your weapons. The point of the fight is to work out how to get to it, but what's cool is that this leads you down different paths depending on your build. Magic users or characters with a bow can simply stand at a high vantage point and pepper the boss with spells or arrows, but if you're playing a melee focused character, you need to work out that damaging a blade lodged in its belly will knock it over and leave it vulnerable. This is also true of the Tower Knight in the second level of Boletaria, a seemingly impossible fight where you're pitched against a 20-foot tall knight with a shield the size of a house. But if you take your time to remove the archers protecting it and then focus on hacking away at its ankles, it'll collapse to the ground, leaving its head open to attack. Essentially, it's not so much about outfighting the boss as it is about outthinking them. And there are even certain bosses that ask you to do this long before the battle even begins, like the Fool's Idol, which will respawn unless you kill a priest hidden away in the upper floors of the cathedral outside the Latrian prison. Now, despite these fights all being very fun and requiring plenty of rolling, blocking and carefully timed attacks, I do have to concede that there are a couple which do feel a touch gimmicky. These are the Dragon God and the Storm King, two genuinely monstrous creatures that come right at the end of Stonefang Tunnel and the Shrine of Storms, and are clearly an effort by the development team to cap off these worlds with a massive cinematic fight. The issue is that Demon's Souls isn't really built for this sort of thing, and rather than letting us duke it out one-on-one, the battles revolve entirely around unique mechanics that feel a little half-baked. Against the Storm King, we have to grab a magical sword that enables us to shoot blasts into the sky, and while it's criminally easy and extremely repetitive, it is at least a pretty epic visual. The Dragon King, on the other hand, has little to redeem it, which is especially odd considering it featured prominently in the game's trailer, and really isn't a great example of what Miyazaki and his team can do. The idea is that rather than taking on the beast directly, we have to use stealth to sneak between various points of cover, avoiding the Dragon God's attacks and firing off various ballista, which for some reason are pointed right at the beast's weak spots. The whole thing is just really clumsy, with rocks awkwardly placed to block your progress and no real tactics or puzzle to solve, something that is particularly confusing as Demon's Souls dabbles with stealth in another fight that works much better. This is the Old Hero in the second level of the Shrine of Storms, a fearsome giant with a massive sword who can easily wipe you out in just a few hits, and who sits behind a very challenging run back which makes him hard to even reach. The trick here is that he is blind, and if you keep very quiet, making sure to hide between each strike, or even using a magical ring that silences your steps, he transforms from a deadly duel into a complete cakewalk, where he swings wildly at ghosts and has no idea where you are. So at this point you might be thinking, Well, as long as you can work out the strategy for each boss, this all sounds quite easy, which doesn't really live up to the series' reputation for mind-numbing difficulty. Well, don't you worry, as the game has a handful of pretty hardcore boss fights, and it's easy to see how these became the dominant style moving forwards, as they are responsible for a lot of collective trauma in the Demon's Souls community. The first that many players run into is the Flame Lurker, a scorching demon who resides at the bottom of Stonefang's second level, and who provides a difficulty spike that has genuinely gone down in history. After spending what feels like hours wandering through monster-filled caves and snaking tunnels, this abomination comes roaring out of the Dragon God's temple and immediately races over to you in a flurry of non-stop aggression. Now, what makes this so challenging is that the fight throws out all of the lessons about combat that we've just spent hours mastering, as taking your time and carefully trying to read the situation will quickly result in your death. This is because the Flame Lurker is extremely aggressive, extremely agile, and thanks to its AoE flame attacks, it can damage you while you are blocking, which means you have to rely on your dodge and your reflexes, something that a lot of players might not be comfortable with. What makes this whole thing even worse is that when you do die, and let's be honest, you will, the route back is extremely long, and it means you can't settle into that flow of repeated attempts where you build muscle memory and start to recognise what you should be doing. As with everything else in Demon's Souls, there are certain tactics you can employ to get an advantage, like finding a flame-resistant shield, or casting a water protection spell, or using a magical blade for more damage. And there is even a hidden shortcut that involves leaping down a huge chasm near the start of the level. But really, the gimmick here is that the only way to beat the Flame Lurker is to actually beat it. The same is true of another notorious boss in Latria, the Man-Eater, which pulls the now classic FromSoftware move of starting you off against a single boss and then throwing another into the mix halfway through. To beginners, this is going to seem like an impossible task, as a single Man-Eater is a pretty tough foe thanks to its mixture of ranged and melee attacks, its high level of aggression, and the fact that you can easily be knocked off the arena, but throwing you against two at the same time. Surely that must have been a mistake. Well, yes and no. The fight is pretty janky, and thanks to the way the Man-Eaters fly around, it can sometimes feel like you're fighting the camera rather than the bosses, but just like with everything else, there are lots of tactics you can turn to. They are weak to fire, so if you're a caster you can try to burn one down before the other even spawns. There are shields that completely block their magical attacks, and really, the more time you spend fighting them, and the more time you spend experimenting, the more manageable the whole thing starts to feel. For many people, these are the two definitive Demon's Souls boss fights, which is fairly understandable considering you can see a lot of the Flame Lurker and Man-Eaters in future FromSoftware classics, where the gimmicks and puzzles were discarded in favour of ever-increasing movesets and skin-of-your-teeth dodging. Ultimately, I think that's a perfectly fine direction to go in, and it's led to the creation of a ton of incredible boss fights. But I want to end this section by looking at what we lost in the process. You see, because FromSoftware and Miyazaki were yet to establish their iconic formula, there is space in Demon's Souls for some really experimental and subversive design, which I think is best exemplified by my favourite boss, the Maiden Astraea. She is the archdemon of the Valley of Defilement, an absolutely horrific set of levels that are both visually unsettling and extremely challenging. It is a damp and dark place, full of creaking shacks and rickety rope bridges, where malnourished creatures called the Depraved Ones sit in squalor and disease, long since forgotten by the nobles of Boletaria in their gleaming castles. This means that when you finally arrive at the final Archstone, your mind is racing with terror at the sort of demon that could rule over such a place. Surely it must be the most depraved and nauseating creature in the entire game. Well, here Miyazaki throws a complete curveball, as when we step into the home of the Maiden Astraea, we aren't greeted by some vast abomination, but by a young priestess clothed in white, who begs us to cease our pillaging and leave her to try and help the poor souls of the valley find peace. In fact, we don't even directly fight her, as she is guarded by a powerful knight called Garl Vinland, who won't even attack you unless you attack him first. an incredible piece of video game subversion that throws everything on its head. Suddenly, we aren't a noble warrior purging the land of demons, but a power-hungry monster, slaying everything in its path in the pursuit of more power. And really, isn't that actually the truth? As we aren't really diving into each level in order to save Boletaria, but to level up our character and gain access to that next spell or weapon. The whole encounter really hammers home just how much slaughter you have conducted in your quest for more souls. And with one final twist of the knife, when Garl Vinland dies and you stand before the maiden, Astraea will call out to her god, and then take her fate into her own hands, determined to rob you of the satisfaction of yet another kill. It is one of the most captivating moments in the entire game, full of the kind of emotional weight that most cinematic cutscene heavy games would kill for, and it simply wouldn't be possible if every single boss fight had to be a frantic duel of dodging, blocking, and hours of learning movesets. While the Hidetaka Miyazaki of 2025 might be best known for crafting bosses that push the boundaries of reasonable difficulty, Demon's Souls is a real reminder that he can do so much more, and I really hope that in future FromSoftware games, we get another glimpse of this talent for boss fights that ask just as much of your mind as they do your reflexes. So on that note, I think this is an appropriate place to switch gears, because given everything we've discussed so far, you'd be forgiven for getting the impression that Demon's Souls is a lonely and isolated experience, where you do nothing but hack down terrible monsters and die over and over again. Well, the truth is that is largely accurate, but there is also a surprising amount of storytelling happening just beneath the surface, and in order for us to drink it all in, we're going to need to talk about the strange way this game uses NPCs. Now, typically role-playing games are a pretty talkative affair, and even in the most basic examples of the genre, meeting all sorts of different people and learning about the world through conversations plays as big of a role as leveling up or exploring dungeons. This is where Demon's Souls feels very different to what you would expect from a normal RPG, because Boletaria is a land where all the towns have been burnt down, all the castles lie in ruin, and humans are all but extinct. Which means if you head into its levels expecting to find lots of quest givers and friendly merchants, you're going to find little more than dust and ash. Now, that being said, we aren't the only adventurer forced into undeath, and as we make our way through the Archstones, a small cast of characters will join us in the Nexus, each of which brings some sort of service and adds a much needed dose of humanity. At first, it's just the crestfallen warrior, who prompts us to head into the first level, the maiden in black, who handles our level ups and prays for our soul, the endlessly grumpy blacksmith Baldwin, and the friendly chap named Stockpile Thomas, who acts as a bank for our unwanted items and provides a stream of positive reinforcement. There isn't much in the way of deeper conversation or lore to be learned, but the group becomes a source of comfort thanks to the functionality they provide. Although after we defeat the first level of the Boletarian Palace, things in the Nexus start to get a lot more interesting. This causes us to be joined by two unnamed NPCs, the Apprentice and the Disciple of God, who sell us magical spells and faith miracles respectively, and will indicate that they are looking for their masters, Sage Frake and Saint Urbane, who have gone missing in Latria and the Shrine of Storms. These are two of the game's optional side quests, and this hyper-natural way of presenting them, where they're mentioned in passing by NPCs and they're left entirely up to the player, was extremely unconventional for 2009. You don't get a waypoint on a map or a log in a quest book, and other than knowing what Archstone they are supposed to be inside, the location of the Saint and the Sage are left entirely up to you to work out. For some people, this is just not enough hand-holding, but there is more care behind the design of these quests than you might initially think, and it's actually quite hard to end up missing them. You find Urbane in the second level of the Shrine of Storms, where a thief named Patches pushes you into a pit, intending to steal your gear, and at the bottom you find the Lost Saint, who similarly fell victim to the trick and who thanks you for freeing him. Frake is a little more hidden, as he's imprisoned in the Latrian jails, but if you make sure to be thorough and open every possible cell whenever you recover a jailer's key, you'll end up freeing the Sage in the natural process of beating the level. Now what's cool is that your reward isn't some arbitrary chunk of souls or a free level up, but more function for the Nexus, as both men will agree to help you by exchanging the souls of bosses for high level miracles and spells, which is an amazing boost in power for faith and magic builds. If you don't need that because you're running a different build, well, there isn't much either man can do to help. A funny move which I actually sort of love, because after all, what would a priest or magician really be able to offer a ninja or a barbarian? Anyway, outside of serving a functional purpose in the Nexus, there are also a handful of NPCs that we can run into in the levels themselves, some of whom will sell us minor items, presumably scavenged from the bodies of dead adventurers, and others who provide insight into the history of this scarred world. One such character is Ostrava of Boletaria, a prince of the kingdom who returned home upon hearing of his father's ruin, and who is determined to save the land from madness and destruction, even if he isn't quite up to the task. During each of the first 3 levels of the Boletarian Palace, we can find him surrounded by enemies, and if we save him, he'll then appear in the Nexus, where we can sit down and let the prince get a few things off his chest. This is particularly interesting because during one of his monologues, he speaks of the lost glory of Boletaria and of the king's imperious round table, but if we pay close enough attention, it becomes clear that the characters he is describing are among the bosses we have been slaying. It's a horrifying revelation because it means that while King Alant's actions did indeed trigger a demonic invasion, the very people who were meant to protect the kingdom turned their back on their oaths and chose madness and power over honour and bravery. Tragically, Ostrava also comes to this realisation, and when we meet him for the final time on the steps of Alant's throne room, where he accepts that the man who is his father is gone, not killed or consumed by a demon, but willingly becoming one in exchange for dark magic. Knowing he cannot face him, he begs us to go to the royal crypt and retrieve 2 legendary swords that can supposedly banish evil. And with that, the young prince takes his death into his own hands. Considering that we only spend a few fleeting moments with Ostrava and that he is often portrayed as a somewhat comical character, it's a really awful end to his story, and a real moment where the horror of what is happening in Boletaria really sinks in. Now, one of the most captivating ideas that comes with this cast of secondary characters is that not everyone is as useful as Saint Urbain or as friendly as Ostrava, and actually there are some pretty terrible consequences for associating with the wrong people. In the second level of Latria, we can discover an imprisoned man wearing jet black armour called Yurt, who asks us to free him, as apparently he is just like us, a slayer of demons. Given how all our other NPC interactions have gone, most players will throw open his cage, which causes him to travel to the Nexus, where he hides away on the 2nd floor and speaks only of mysterious work that must be done. Clearly something is off here, but nothing can prepare you for what happens next, as every time you defeat a boss, Yurt will kill one of the NPCs in the Nexus. Discovering the bloodied body of Saint Urbain, or even Patches the Thief, who will repent and become a merchant if you decide to spare him, well, it just feels absolutely horrible and punctures the illusion of safety that the Nexus has always provided. And of course, thanks to the game's merciless autosave, it is completely permanent. Now, you might not realise who is doing this at first, but eventually even the most unaware player will clock that it is Yurt and go to confront him. What is even more fascinating about this character is that there is a lot more going on here than just a murderer. You see, if for some reason you decide to kill any of the game's NPCs and then kill Yurt before he can begin his massacre, you will be contacted by his employer. This is Mephistopheles, and as it turns out, Yurt wasn't a lone psychopathic madman, but an assassin hired to kill everyone left in Boletaria that could use magic, as Mephistopheles' order believed that this might break the cycle of greed that caused the Old One to awaken. Incredibly, she offers you the very same contract, and you can then begin your own killing spree, taking out almost every named character in the Nexus and even poor Ostrava of Boletaria. Actually doing this feels like pure evil, but the fact that you even can, and that Miyazaki created a character who attempts to justify the slaughter, is just a brilliant piece of reactive design, made all the sweeter by the fact that most players will never even see it. Now, broadly speaking, this video has been extremely positive, and quite rightly so, as Demon's Souls is one of the most original and inventive games to have ever been made. But it is also not without its faults, and I want to end this section by talking about an element of its quest design that I have always disliked. You see, an important aspect of world tendency relates to the safety of each archstone, with the idea being that in pure white you'll see more NPCs, and that in pure black those same NPCs will become extremely dangerous phantoms. Obviously this involves the same exact issues as with all of the world tendency systems, in that it's basically impossible to understand without any outside information, but in respect to the NPCs I find it particularly frustrating. For example, in Stonefang Tunnel, you can come across a man named Skirvir the Wanderer, who is hunting the depths for a legendary sword said to be made out of a slab of rock, a weapon that he jokes is barely a sword at all. Once we defeat the Dragon God and revisit the world in pure white tendency, we can find this weapon, the Dragon Smasher, which I'm pretty sure is meant to be a reference to Guts Dragon Slayer in Berserk. And when we show this to Skirvir, he is overjoyed and gifts us a rare crafting material. It's not a major moment by any means, and missing out on it doesn't affect a playthrough whatsoever, but it is still a cool little moment of humanity that helps balance out all the endless doom, which means that gating this behind an obscure set of requirements doesn't really make much sense to me. Unfortunately, there are even more baffling instances of this, like in the case of Selen Vinland, the sister of the maiden's protector Garl, who had come to the Valley of Defilement in the hope of finding her brother and convincing him to return home. She will only appear if the valley is in pure white, but for most players that will have involved already killing Garl and the maiden, something which you cannot tell Selen about even if you're wearing his armour and wielding his weapons. To make matters even more confusing, if you then return to the maiden's boss arena, Garl will have respawned as a Black Phantom, and upon his second death, he drops a crest that you can show Selen, which convinces her that he was beyond saving and causes her to head home. Obviously, the whole questline is basically nonsensical, and by creating this strange system whereby NPCs will only appear after a specific amount of bosses have been killed, FromSoftware have ended up derailing an interaction which would have otherwise made the terror of what we did to the maiden even more intense. Now in reality, for a game that experiments this much with the conventions of the RPG genre, you're not always going to hit a home run, and I think the handful of misses are more than worth this extremely creative approach to video game characters. Even beyond what we've discussed, there is an executioner who the king sends to murder you after declaring you to be a traitor. There's an entirely different spell vendor that you have to free from a tower by impersonating a Boletarian official. There is a heroic NPC who will jump in midway through a boss fight, and you can even discover a secret illegitimate child of King Alant, languishing in the Latrian prisons. Sure, you might have to look a lot of this stuff up, and certainly won't see all of it on your first playthrough, but the very fact that it is there at all adds so much texture. And it means that for all the isolation that makes this game tick, some of Demon's Souls' best moments are when it is at its most alive. Given we've just been talking about how Demon's Souls handles its various human characters, I think it's high time we got onto the question of how you play with other actual humans, because quite a lot of Demon's Souls' massive legacy is found in its very original take on multiplayer gameplay. Now unfortunately, this is also where we come crashing into one of the big issues with this video, because it is no longer possible to play Demon's Souls online, as its PS3 servers were turned off in 2018. Obviously, this has made capturing footage for this section a little tricky, and while there are community-run private servers, they're largely populated with hardcore PvP-focused veterans, so they wouldn't really give a proper reflection of what the game was like back when it launched. Instead, we're going to have to make do with some slightly less literal visuals, courtesy of various recordings from YouTube, links to which are provided in the bibliography down below if you'd like to check them out. Anyway, as we discussed when we were talking about Demon's Souls development, Miyazaki's grand idea was to take that snowy encounter on his evening commute, where strangers helped push his car to the top of a hill, and turn it into something that could work in an action RPG. This was a very odd objective, but amazingly, he managed to do just that, as Demon's Souls launched with an extremely novel take on multiplayer gaming, and one that is still highly influential to this day. Now, in my opinion, Demon's Souls' online ideas break down into 3 distinct flavours: the sharing of information, the sharing of pain, and the giving of pain, a triad of peculiar interactive systems that impact every second of the game. The first is very straightforward. Dotted all around the levels, you'll see various short messages left by other players, and by pressing select, you can leave your own. The purpose behind this is to create a sort of community spirit, because every time you upvote a message, the original author will receive a heal, and this encourages players to leave helpful tips about enemy weaknesses or advice about where to go. Obviously, the system is still rife with potential for trolling, especially when it comes to messages that make deadly pits look like they might be hiding secrets or shortcuts. But in a weird way, that unreliability is what makes the system so good. You're never quite sure if you can trust what you're reading, and it adds this level of unpredictability, where you still want to feel things out for yourself and never rely on the wisdom of the crowd. Now, on top of this, other players are also visible through their ghosts and bloodstains, one of which gives you a temporary glimpse of what other players are doing, and the other, an insight into how they died. Neither really add much to the gameplay, as you can't see the enemies they are fighting, but it is a nice little reminder that other people are struggling. Seeing a huge spread of bloodstains just before a boss does have an oddly comforting effect. So beyond glimpsing their failures, we can also interact with players in a much more tangible way. And this brings us onto how Demon's Souls wants its players to share the burden and inflict misery on each other. This comes in the form of 2 items, the blue-eyed stone and the black-eyed stone, which are given to you when you defeat your first boss and your first black phantom respectively, with both requiring you to be in soul form in order for them to work. We'll start with the blue-eyed stone, which governs co-op, as you can use this to place down a marker which will randomly appear in another player's world and allow them to summon you for assistance. Once you're in, the only way you can communicate is through some basic emotes, and it leads to a chaotic but very powerful fellowship, where you're trying to wordlessly protect one another until you can take down the level boss, which then sends you back to your own world, restored in human form. Given how world tendency works, this isn't actually a particularly good reward, especially as it doesn't shift the tendency in your own playthrough. But the sheer satisfaction found in helping others quickly caught on with the player base. It was very common to see lots of blue eye markers outside of boss rooms or at the start of notoriously difficult sections, and while there were plenty of complaints about how you couldn't directly matchmake with friends, this style of faceless and thankless cooperation quickly became a big part of the Demon's Souls equation. Now, funnily enough, this is the mechanic that gave birth to the notoriously toxic Get Good debate, where certain members of the Souls fandom would insist that summoning assistance invalidated that player's victory, and that you weren't really playing the game properly unless you did it yourself. Personally, I've always found this argument to be pretty ridiculous, because if you weren't meant to summon assistance, the system wouldn't be there, and it makes even less sense when you consider that it was the brainchild of Miyazaki, and one of the ideas he was most excited about. The system is clearly meant to be a modular form of difficulty, and while the experience of taking down the Flame Lurker with a summoned saviour and doing it yourself after 50 attempts are very clearly different things, they are both an intended part of the experience, and neither one is more valid than the other. Anyway, on the other side of this friendly dynamic, there is the black-eyed stone, which when placed will send you into another player's world, but as an invader, where your goal is to slay your opponent before they can escape. Unsurprisingly, this proved to be very controversial, as most players were having a hard enough time beating the levels without other players jumping in and killing them. But I've got to be honest, I love the sheer chaos that invasions bring to the game. So much of Demon's Souls is about learning exactly how it works, where an enemy will jump out from, how many hits it takes to kill them, how to avoid the ambush, or knowing exactly where to stand at the right time. And the invasions totally throw all of this out the window, thrusting you into a frantic battle for your life against an opponent that is far harder to predict. Now, for a lot of players, the result is usually that they just immediately die. But in a funny sort of way, I think even this adds something to the experience, as it creates a sort of karmic balance where you might rely on a stranger to help you defeat a boss, only to be invaded a few hours later and lose all your progress. considering this was all produced at a time when online gaming largely revolved around arena deathmatches, wonky netcode, and two-player campaign co-op. It is safe to say that Demon's Souls was a real innovator. But what is even more impressive is that even within these crazy ideas, Miyazaki and his team were already experimenting. One of the most memorable moments in the entire game comes in the form of a boss fight called the Old Monk, the archdemon of Latria who summons a powerful minion to protect itself when you finally arrive at its throne. What makes this so interesting is that the minion is almost always another player, as the monk checks for any blue or black markers in the level and then pulls that player in, forcing you into a totally unpredictable duel where you have no idea what you'll be fighting. It could be a barbarian who crushes your block in a single swipe, a magician who's going to spam high-level spells, a ninja that will parry you to death. There's literally no way to know. And when you finally emerge victorious, the knowledge that you didn't just beat a boss, but another player, makes it so much sweeter. Now the cool thing about this is that if you are the one who is summoned, your reward is an incredibly powerful piece of gear that buffs your magic damage and resistance by 40%. And this means that there is real motivation to be the villain and ruin another player's day. The whole idea is just so damn cool, and the fact that it works without any sort of load times or janky matchmaking is a real tribute to just how well Miyazaki's team delivered on an idea that had literally never been done before. Without invasions, ghostly messages, and jolly cooperation, the entire landscape of online gaming in 2025 would probably be completely different. So the next time you deliver someone's lost package in Death Stranding, or team up with a pawn in Dragon's Dogma, or collect a time capsule in Subnautica, say a quiet little thank you to those nameless strangers who helped push Miyazaki's car through the snow. Between world tendency, online invasions, the crazed cast of NPCs, the wild way that bosses work, and the excruciating difficulty, it can be easy to forget that Demon's Souls is telling a story. So in this last chapter of analysis, we're going to answer one final question. What happens when all of the demons are dead? The first thing to point out is that the road through which you arrive at Demon's Souls finale will not be the same for every player, and that's because of the open-ended nature of the game's structure. As our only goal is to defeat the 5 archdemons, your final battle could be against the Storm King, the Maiden, the Latrian Monk, or the Dragon God. But if I'm being honest, I've always found these battles lack that cinematic narrative punch that should come in a game's dying hours. This is why it has always made the most sense to me to leave the 4th level of the Boletarian Palace until the very end, as it is dripping in story beats and visual design that feel tailor-made for a conclusion. Here you not only fight the strongest enemies in the game, like Black Phantoms and Alant's Royal Guard, but we have one last tussle with the dragons from the opening levels of the game, and say goodbye to Ostrava, who will disappear on the steps of the throne room if we saved him in previous levels. The finality of his journey then flows into the level's boss, which takes place in the ruins of the Boletarian Palace and pits us against none other than the old King Alant. Now what makes this fight so excellent is not only that Alant has a complex and aggressive moveset that will punish even a very high level character, and that he has a crazy gimmick attack that will cause you to de-level if he catches you, but it's because he feels like us. This isn't some ancient dragon that we have to defeat with machines or a monstrous stingray soaring through the sky, but instead Alant is nothing more than a man that has consumed an endless amount of demon souls, and the whole fight is really holding up a mirror to the character that we have been building. By leaving Boletaria to the end of the game, Demon's Souls concludes with a suitably epic fight against the man who triggered this entire mess, and for almost every other developer in history, this would have been the obvious place to roll the credits. But the thing is, Hidetaka Miyazaki does not think like other developers, and so instead we are treated to one of the most subversive and surprising conclusions in modern video game history. When Alant finally dies, nothing initially seems amiss. We see the demon was destroyed splash across our screen, and we are returned to human form, just like with any other boss. but when we attempt to use the Archstone, something odd happens. A mysterious disembodied voice booms out across the land, questioning how we were able to defeat its demon and musing that surely now the Old One will summon us. This turns out to be true, and when we return to the Nexus, we see the gleaming glass floor smashed open and are beckoned in by the Maiden in Black, who tells us that the time has finally come to confront the demon god. So we step forward and fall into the abyss, only to appear in a desolate and liminal wasteland, where out of the distant mists, a huge creature lurches towards us, a being made of stone and wood and light, groaning under the weight of its own enormous bulk. The Old One. Now, what has always struck me about this sequence is that in any other RPG, this would be the final showdown, where we strike down the demonic beast and break the cycle of destruction. But here, the Old One hardly even feels threatening, and we see the Maiden in Black command it to be good, as if it were some sort of domestic pet. What's even more confusing is that as we walk into the god's glowing maw, we once again hear that disembodied voice from the Boletarian throne room. And when we step through a fog gate and into the inner chamber, we realise that this was not the voice of demon kind, but that of the real King Allant. This is the true final boss, but in stark contrast to the endless parade of terror and death that is the rest of the game's villains, Allant is a pathetic and weak character, transformed into little more than a shrivelling worm who can't even attack. It's surprisingly disarming, and you'll probably spend a few moments trying to work out if this is some sort of trick, but it is not. Demon's Souls genuinely does end with a battle against its most feeble enemy, a fight that you literally cannot lose. Now obviously, this is a pretty wild thing to do, and even now you can find Reddit threads and Twitter posts popping up from people disappointed by the lack of excitement, but I really believe this is another masterful move of Miyazaki-inspired subversion. You see, when we first step into the heart of the Old One, the king begs us to see his perspective, that humanity needs to be exterminated and that we should surrender ourselves to the demons. For many people, this is just another generic JRPG villain, claiming that life is misery and death is freedom, a trope as tired as time itself. But if you think back to the tales of the Monumentals, I actually think that Allant is not quite as nihilistic as he sounds. This is a world where it is certain that the Old One will rise again, where the fog will eventually return, and where thousands of innocent people will be subjected to awful deaths at the hands of demons that can never be truly defeated. If this really was the cycle that you and every one of your descendants were trapped in, might you not come to believe that death was actually compassion? Could Allant be motivated by a kind of twisted kindness, rather than psychotic nihilism? Amazingly, it is this question that defines the very last moments of Demon's Souls, as when the king lies dead, the maiden enters the chamber and begins the process of lulling the Old One back to sleep. But before everything can end, we must walk over to the exit and choose to leave. Now you might ask why that is necessary, but think, if you were convinced by Allant's argument, would you let the maiden complete her song? Wouldn't you strike her down and let nature take its course? Many people frame this as a moral choice, a good and bad ending, one where the world is renewed and another where it falls into darkness, but I don't think this is what the team were going for. We've known that this world was doomed from the very first few screens of the game, where we are told in no uncertain terms that demons were placed upon the earth to consume humans, and nothing that we've done or that has ever been done in the past has ever changed this fundamental landscape. It doesn't matter how many monsters we kill or what choices we make, whether now or in the future, eventually someone will falter, and when they do, that thick, colourless fog will return and cover the entire world. For a game that is so focused on ideas like challenging combat, memorable boss fights, complex level design and esoteric systems, this is a beautifully cinematic ending, and it truly baffles me that it's been remembered as a disappointment rather than the cutting satire of tired RPG ideas that it actually is. So with that, the credits roll and Demon's Souls comes to a close. but in a very cool move, the cyclical nature of this world is reflected in what happens next, as you're immediately thrust back to your awakening in the Nexus and into New Game Plus. Now, I've always loved this concept in RPGs, but it works particularly well in Demon's Souls, because it totally changes the complexion of the earlier levels and ultimately leads to a very different kind of challenge. The game's early hours are largely all about confusion, experimenting, and feeling your way into the mechanics. So to come up against the Phalanx or the Tower Knight with all your late game gear and high powered spells creates a real sense of satisfaction, where you can see clearly how far you've progressed. That being said, it's not all about rewarding power fantasy, as every time you beat the game, enemies get a big jump in hit points and in damage. And while this doesn't feel particularly noticeable in the first few levels, by the midway point, the difficulty really starts to ramp up again. By the time you're refighting the Flame Lurker or the Man-Eaters, you're right back to that feeling of weakness from when you first started. And it's a real testament to the depth of the gameplay and the systems that they can sustain back-to-back playthroughs on the exact same character. So, without meaning to sound trite, that is Demon's Souls. A truly unique game that catapulted FromSoftware and Hidetaka Miyazaki into the limelight, placing them on the path that would eventually lead to Dark Souls and Elden Ring, and rewriting the book on third-person RPG gameplay in the process. It is one of the most influential 3D games of all time. But the story does not end in 2009, as over a decade later, the fog would once again return, as Demon's Souls burst back into life in a whole new form. Here we arrive at a rather peculiar epilogue, because the story of Demon's Souls actually continues without FromSoftware. You see, part of the original deal to fund the game had mandated that Sony would retain ownership of the Demon's Souls IP, and given how their lack of belief had almost killed the game at launch, it should come as no surprise that FromSoftware weren't exactly keen to produce a sequel. This led to their next title being published by Bandai Namco, a little-known game called Dark Souls, which built on almost everything that made Demon's Souls so good, and thanks to it releasing on every single platform, it supercharged the company's popularity and turned Miyazaki into a legend. Now, while they went their separate ways after Demon's Souls, Sony and FromSoftware would eventually end up working together again, as in 2015 they put out Bloodborne, a gothic horror twist on Miyazaki's now iconic action RPG formula, and a strong argument for the greatest HD game ever made. Now, given this highly successful reunion, rumours about a potential remake of Demon's Souls began to swirl, and not without good reason, as the PS4 was not backwards compatible, and without a PC port, Demon's Souls felt trapped in a distant generation. Now, despite being asked about this constantly, Miyazaki was always firm in his opinion that he wasn't interested in looking backwards, and that any potential remake would be down to Sony, and would likely involve a different studio. Well, fast forward to 2020, and that is exactly what happened, as during the PlayStation 5 showcase reveal, a live stream where Sony showed off all the exciting things that were coming to their new console, it was announced that Demon's Souls was coming back. Rather than FromSoftware, the studio tasked with this job was Bluepoint Games, a very interesting company that had started to make quite a name for themselves as dedicated remake specialists. They had been formed by Andy O'Neill and Marco Thrush, two developers that had worked at Retro Studios and had decided to go solo in 2006, where they had initially struggled to get anything going until an offer came in from Sony. They wanted the team to port God of War 1 and 2 to the PS3 before the third entry came out, but rather than just slapping together a cheap emulated version, Bluepoint dramatically improved the frame rate and resolution of both games, which won them a lot of praise from fans and critics alike. This kickstarted a flurry of similar projects, where Bluepoint would be given a collection of older games, like the PS2 work of Team Ico, or the first 3 Metal Gear Solid games, or Naughty Dog's PS3 Uncharted trilogy, and then they port them to modern systems, while also carrying out a pretty substantial facelift. Each time they did this, their work got more refined, and it eventually led to the team being trusted to create a full top-to-bottom remake of Team Ico's Shadow of the Colossus, a seriously prestigious job that resulted in a wave of stellar reviews and sales numbers that were actually higher than the PS2 original. Now, what set Bluepoint apart from other studios was that they weren't just remaking these games by eye, but instead that they had a very unique approach to development, where they would take the game's source code, get it working on their target platform, and then build on top of it. This meant that things like animations and wire models could all be kept identical, while the rest of the game was patched up with modern tech like advanced lighting or newer physics engines. And this method of honouring the past while looking to the future won them a lot of fans. So when it was announced that they were being trusted to bring Demon's Souls out from its PS3 isolation, there was a lot of excitement, especially as Bluepoint made it clear in interviews that their sole objective was to visually overhaul the original, rather than messing with its gameplay. Well, when it released in November of 2020, it looked as if Demon's Souls had done it again, as the critical response was overwhelmingly positive, leading to a Metacritic average of 92, and despite the COVID pandemic making it almost impossible to get hold of a PS5, the game sold over 2 million copies in just 8 weeks. By all the normal measurements, Bluepoint had done a smashing job, so you might be surprised to hear that their remake has developed a bit of a mixed reputation in recent years, with some commentators even going as far as to call it an artistic disaster. Now, I think that is a tad hyperbolic, but there are some real issues worth discussing, as well as some pretty strong reasons to like this version. So, today we're going to try and put together a fair picture of just what exactly Bluepoint made. The first thing to note is that just like the studio promised, in terms of its structure, design and systems, this is a very faithful remake. And everything from the movesets of the weapons, to the location of items and enemies, to the mechanics behind the bosses, and yes, even world tendency, have all been lovingly recreated exactly as they were in the original. As far as video game remakes go, this is actually quite rare to see, as publishers won't usually spend the money to update a game visually without also making massive changes to the gameplay. So in this respect, I think Sony have gone into this with the right mindset. I imagine it would have been very tempting to swap out the traditional healing items for Dark Souls style Estus flasks, or redesign the less interesting bosses like the Dirty Colossus and the Dragon God, or even strip out the world tendency system altogether, but instead they chose to make a game that presents the original experience largely as it was, warts and all. Now, that isn't to say it's exactly the same, as Bluepoint have made some modernizations that were clearly influenced by FromSoftware's more modern titles. The clunky 4-way rolling of the original has been swapped out with Dark Souls 3 style omnidirectional movement, and the camera, which previously sat quietly in the background, focused only on the player, now moves with quite a bit of cinematic flair, where it'll do things like pull out to show off a particularly lush environment. Along with this, there are a handful of smaller quality of life changes, like how you can send items back to the Nexus when your inventory is full, which was always very annoying to deal with, or how you can see your weapon durability visible on screen at all times. But if I'm totally honest, these changes aren't enough to make it feel like a dramatically different game. For purists, this is obviously blasphemy, but I've always considered Demon's Souls' identity to be found in the broad strokes of its design, rather than in the minutiae. So to me, having slightly different iframes, or a slightly different perspective, or a new menu UI, well, that is far less important than keeping the level design, the bosses, and the systems intact. Now, as if that wasn't heretical enough, I actually think Bluepoint missed a golden opportunity to be a tad more ambitious, as Demon's Souls has always had the potential for more content in the form of its legendary Lost Sixth Archstone, the Land of the Giants, which sits ominously broken at the top of the Nexus, and has always been speculated to be a set of levels that were cut late in development. I think that had this been fleshed out in a new post-game area, or even in a chunk of painted world style DLC, that would have been a really cool way to expand upon the original without messing up the purity of the core remake. but alas, Bluepoint were focused exclusively on presentation. Here we arrive at the bulk of the controversy, because while the Demon's Souls remake looks objectively beautiful, with utterly sumptuous lighting, incredibly detailed textures, and butter-smooth 60 FPS performance, the art direction is actually quite different. You see, while the original uses architecture and colour to great effect, it is quite a visually simple game, and it's clear that Bluepoint went into this project looking to massively increase the complexity on screen and implement a much more modern cinematic fantasy style. In isolation, it looks utterly fantastic, but when you compare it side by side with FromSoftware's PS3 version, there are quite a few places where Bluepoint have really deviated from the original designs. The poster child for this is the new look of the Boletarian officials, who in the original were portrayed as disturbed purple monsters, whose faces were frozen in a twisted and mocking smile. Rather than sticking with this, Bluepoint have entirely redesigned them, so that now they are swollen and sickly, covered in boils and constantly looking as if they are in pain, which is quite a big shift as it changes how we perceive the men carrying out the evil of King Alant. Similarly, there are little moments like a lightning bolt suddenly striking a tree in the Shrine of Storms, or the nauseating mists being pulled back in the Valley of Defilement to create a much more open vista. And generally speaking, the overall tone has been shifted from one of melancholy ruin to more of an epic adventure. Now, whether this matters or not is a point of personal preference. As for many people, it'll be more than worth the jump to 60 FPS and glorious true HD. But there is one area where I think Bluepoint have objectively dropped the ball, and that is with the soundtrack. For some reason, rather than replicating Shunsuke Kida's work with higher quality audio or live instrumentation, the game's iconic tracks have all been reimagined, and much like with the visuals, it now has a much more traditional cinematic feel. Instead of the weird combinations of drums, horns, keys, strings, and choral music that gave the original such an unsettling atmosphere, most of the tracks have been reworked into soaring orchestral arrangements that were heavily influenced by the bombastic style of Bloodborne. In my opinion, this was a huge mistake, simply because the grandeur of these new tracks doesn't always match with the events on screen. And hearing the haunting harpsichord of the Maiden Astraea, or the quiet strings of the Maiden in Black, transformed into thick walls of sound, doesn't really deliver the correct tone. Now, this might make it sound like those accusations of an artistic disaster have some merit, but the thing is, video games are a holistic experience, and there is much more to them than just art and sound. The biggest defense of the Demon's Souls remake, and something that is constantly overlooked by its critics, is that it gives you a way to experience the game's online systems exactly as originally intended. Sure, you could load up an emulator and play the PS3 version in a private server with a handful of grizzled veterans, but as we already discussed, that isn't really that close to the original experience. And I think even for all its artistic liberties, the remake allows more casual players to experience the game in the way that Miyazaki envisaged. You're supposed to see messages on the floor. You're supposed to fight a stranger when you face the old monk. You're supposed to live in fear of a sudden invasion, and you're supposed to rejoice when a stranger helps you out of a bind. These are key parts of the Demon's Souls formula, and by playing the PS3 version offline, you're missing out on a big part of the fun. So I think to discount the remake entirely because of its look and sound, and ignore that it keeps this integral part alive, well, it really is an incomplete assessment. The truth is that there is no perfect way to re-experience Demon's Souls exactly as it was in 2009. So you always need to make some sort of judgment call about what you are happy to miss out on. It's not about soul versus soulless, but about what draws you into Boletaria in the first place. If it's the purity of FromSoftware's original work and the jagged but genius ideas sitting underneath it, go ahead and fire up a dusty old PlayStation 3 and experience one of the most subversive and influential action RPGs that has ever been made. But at the same time, If you love the Souls games for the intensity of their combat and want something much more polished, or if you want to be immersed in a jaw-dropping, high-definition fantasy nightmare, or even if you just want to load into other people's games and ruin their day, Bluepoint's interpretation of Miyazaki's first masterpiece is a perfectly good substitute. The word underrated gets thrown around quite a lot on the internet, especially when it comes to moderately popular video games on YouTube. But the whole reason I wanted to make this video is because I honestly believe that Demon's Souls is still an extremely underappreciated video game. Yes, the original eventually overcame Sony's lack of backing and did manage to ship a decent amount of copies. And yes, it did eventually get a high-profile remake that brought in millions of new souls. But even so, I don't think that Hidetaka Miyazaki's first action RPG enjoys anything like the legacy it deserves. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that a good deal of its notoriety is owed to the success of the series it spawned, as Demon's Souls is often spoken about as if it were some strange Dark Souls prototype, a skeleton onto which the flesh and muscle of Estus Flasks and Smaug and Ornstein had yet to be grafted. A messy first attempt at a set of ideas which would later be perfected in the crucible of Lordran. In my opinion, this is a baffling assessment of what Demon's Souls actually is, as so much of what makes FromSoftware so popular and what makes Miyazaki such a revered designer was here right from the very start. The chunky and methodical combat, the open-ended RPG progression, the terror of losing your souls, the reward from overcoming impossible odds, the mania of the faceless online system, the tragic characters and the half-dead world. This was all done first in Demon's Souls, and I think it is owed far more credit for proving the concepts that would go on to make its descendants so famous. Considering the flowers that we constantly give to other bold innovators, Super Mario 64, GoldenEye, Final Fantasy VII, Street Fighter 2 or GTA 3, you'd imagine that grace would be extended to Demon's Souls, but just try looking for it on any greatest games of all time list. You'll see Bloodborne, you'll see Sekiro, you might see Elden Ring, and you'll definitely see Dark Souls. But the game that created the very foundations upon which they sit, the game that broke every industry convention and became a success despite its publisher abandoning it, well, just like the empty streets of Boletaria, you will find nothing. Now sure, Demon's Souls is not a perfect video game, but if we judge a piece of art on the originality of its ideas, the quality with which it executes its vision, and the raw influence that it had on everything that came after, I think it is beyond obvious that it deserves to sit alongside any of those legendary titles. I am not so arrogant that I think this video will change a reputation that has been decades in the making, but the next time you find yourself talking about the genius of Hidetaka Miyazaki, don't let Demon's Souls slip out of the conversation. Remind people that he only joined FromSoftware because he fell in love with Eco, and despite having no idea how a video game was made, he ended up being promoted to director after just a single year at the company. Remind people that Demon's Souls was initially a complete mess, and that Sony was so confident it would fail that they cut its international release. Remind people that despite difficulty and boss fights going out of fashion, and cinematic handholding taking over the industry, people loved Miyazaki's crazy ideas so deeply that Demon's Souls not only broke out in spite of its publisher, but spawned one of the most acclaimed series of all time. It is one of the greatest origin stories in video game history, and just like the crumbling streets of Boletaria or the hallowed halls of the Nexus, it deserves to stand in the shining light of day, without a speck of fog in sight. Umbasa, and thanks for watching. In a move that will surprise precisely no one, I want to end this video with a huge thanks to every one of my patrons for choosing to spend your money on keeping this crazy place going. I know it's been a little while since the last traditional I finished a video game retrospective, but putting this one together really reignited my love for underappreciated video game history. So hopefully that's come through in the script and it was worth the wait. As for what's next, I'm in the middle of putting together a pretty big Patreon video where I'm ranking and reviewing every single game that I played this year. So if you want to hear me talk about how I got addicted to Ball Pit, or why I kind of hated the Silent Hill 2 remake, or weigh in on the endless Silksong vs Expedition 33 Game of the Year debate, well, that'll be going live in about a week's time. Also in the run up to Christmas, I'm going to do a few extra streams and play through Metroid Prime 4. So if you want to explore the wild nonsense that is Samus Aran riding a motorbike through a silent desert, you're more than welcome to come hang out over on Twitch. Obviously there are more big videos in the works, but I think we'll be in 2026 by the time they come out. So if I don't see you before then, have a wonderful Christmas, have a great new year, and I'll see you on the next one.